which is a secular way of life, cultic practice in the Judean highlands during the intermediate Bronze Age. Helena, please, if you just share your screen, excellent. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers for having me here. So the title of this lecture requires a title of itself or a lecture of itself. So many terms that needs to be defined and clarified. And for example, what is cult? And could there be such a thing as a secular way of life? Can we really draw a line between the sanctified and the profane? For Latour, a rigid boundary simply cannot be drawn around religion, except within a very specific secular, modern imaginary. All aspects in life, in a non-modern society, are interconnected and intertwined. And one doesn't need to find the temple in order to trace an ancient community's ritual. We must cast away the image of a cultic corner to which a person would go twice a day to perform their ritual. There was no cultic corner, and it exists only in our post-modern, post-enlightenment mind. It is only the result of modernity that one can go to a synagogue and then go to work, and these would be two separate actions which differ in their level of sanctity, awareness, and purposefulness. What we as researchers must do is to look closely at the complex fabric of everyday life and try to find the trail of interconnectedness, as it had dominated every aspect of ancient cosmology, regardless of place and time. And for this purpose, one must not only examine finds which are clearly of ritual nature, but to be minded of the context in which these things are found. It is through a multi-tiered investigation of actions of everyday life that one can tap into the cosmology of a certain community. In my case, into the intermediate Bronze Age community of Nachal Rephaim in particular. This is what I will attempt to show you in this talk by presenting the finds from the intermediate Bronze Age phase of occupation at Nachal Rephaim, the rural site of Nachal Rephaim. And I will try to interpret their symbolic or cosmologic significance. The site is located in the Jerusalem highlands, approximately 8 kilometers southwest of the old city of Jerusalem, on the northern bank of the Rephaim stream. It was discovered during the survey that preceded the establishment of the Tish family biblical zoo, and excavated by Emanuel Eisenberg during the 1980s on behalf of the Department of Antiquity and later the Israel Antiquity Authority. This large rural site exposed in the excavation areas measured approximately 5 hectares with 2 main strata of occupation. The earliest consisted of the intermediate Bronze Age houses, and the second, the later, the intermediate Bronze Age houses are marked on this plan in blue. And the second phase, or the later phase, marked in black, are the Middle Bronze Age structures. The site was later buried by agricultural terraces of late antiquity, but here I will also, of course, discuss only the finds from the intermediate Bronze Age stratum or strata. The site was occupied for a number of living phases during the intermediate Bronze Age, during the dated to the 24th to the 22nd century BCE. Sometime during this period, not necessarily throughout this entire period. The houses were built with thin walls, the foundation of which were made of 1 row of stones, topped with mud brick, superstructure made of mud brick. And the better preserved architectural units were uncovered in the northeastern part of the site, with several distinct households or houses or clusters of houses, with the largest cluster, most preserved cluster in the areas that is marked here 700 and 800 right here, in between these well-preserved houses in the heart. And according to my numbering and my understanding of this area, there are at least 7 complete or semi-complete households or bits of households which are built together within this one particularly preserved area. The subsistence economy of the site relied mainly on farming and herding of sheep and goat, although pigs and cattle were also present in the assemblages and possibly also equid, donkeys. And these animals were kept for meat, work, secondary products, possibly also other chores. The community produced their own, this is the most preserved area. The community produced their own ceramic vessels for their own use and possibly for also trade, and controlled all resources required for the task, from readily available marl, water, dolomite sand for temper, and fuel wood for firing. So they were completely independent in this scope. This was the first site that was discovered in the south central southern Levant, which pointed to the presence of sedentary population in the region during the late 3rd millennium BCE. Up until that point, it was the notion that most of the population here was mobile, dominated the academic landscape, and this site changed that. And today, with more and more known sedentary sites, its importance has not faded. It is still the largest and the better preserved site in its region, and it enables a very deep understanding of contemporaneous economies and society, or economy and society of this particular site. Furthermore, the site itself, as well as its surrounding, is rich with intermediate Bronze Age burials, few of which survived intact to modern times. Thus, investigating the remains left in the houses as well as in the tombs sheds light on the aspects of the belief and social norms within this community. As the site of Nachal Ephraim preserved many aspects of everyday life, I can present a variety of finds, each of which received their own session in this conference. I will start with finds which are typically or obviously cultic, and move on to finds which would have been traditionally categorized as profane. I will present installations of standing stones, zoomorphic figurines, and burial practices, all while considering their architectural and spatial relation. I will also focus on social aspects of the ancient society and ritual activity, social ritual activity. Furthermore, social practice, interpreted with the help of social theory, will also contribute to the discussion of the unseen world of belief of the Nachal Ephraim community. So starting with standing stones and the significance of the standing stone and the relationship between the stone and man was very well outlined in the previous lecture by Uzi Avner. And their longevity in the unseen cosmology of the people, well, apparently not only in the arid regions, but also in the Judean highlands, goes very long back, to very common from the Neolithic period, but also previous, also earlier. And this the symbolism and function of standing stones must not be perceived as one and the same throughout space and time. But it is always a marked object. It is always something that is rising high, tall, pronounced, different from its environment. And the relationship between human and stone, stone, which is the foundation of Earth, reflects the interconnectedness of everything to everything else, which dominated the non-modern cosmologies, regardless of place and time. What can we say something about the relationship between the communities of the intermediate Bronze Age community of Nachal Ephraim and their standing stones? So looking through where can we find these standing stones? 3 households contain standing stones installations: area 100, area 1000, and area 1100. Oddly enough, the largest and most preserved area right in the middle, area 700 right here, did not yield any standing stones whatsoever. So starting with area 1000, a row of 5 flat standing stones were placed in the northwesternmost small room. And 2 of them were actually listening to Uzi Avner's lecture. I wasn't going to mention it, but now I will. 3 stones were standing upright and 2 stones were on their wide side. So if we take the suggestion presented by Uzi Avner, then we have 3 male deities and 2 female deities. In any case, it is different from the following standing stones, which I'm about to present, and this is what is important here, the variety. In this context, a jar, a milling stone, and a mortar were also found in the same small space. Moving on to the next area, area 100. This one is a good one. The standing stone was placed in a small side room, right here, the small side room, of course, with restricted access, similarly to the way that all houses kept their long-term storage, their large storage jars, which were kept in small side rooms with limited access. In area 1100, 2 jars were placed on the paved floor adjacent to the standing stone. And it appears that the domestic standing stone, they shared space with everyday activity. They were always placed together with storage jars or milling stones or other tools that had to do with everyday subsistence economy. And they were always in these tucked away chambers with restricted access, maybe possibly indicating that they, much as like the storage jars, are personal property. Moving on to the zoomorphic figurines, they represent one of the only forms of figurative art objects that we can find during the Intermediate Bronze Age, if we exclude the rock art of the Negev and the Golan. And this can teach us something about man-beast or man-animal relations regardless of the identification, the zoological identification of this figurine. 2 miniature figurines were found at the site, both at area 700, the preserved one. One in the top one that you can see was found in a collapse above a floor, and the low one in the main chamber of a house, all within regular domestic context. And they are commonly referred to as donkey figurines, but they were also interpreted as deer or dog. They're very small, they're very tiny, they're about 5 centimeters, and they can fit in the palm or in a pocket, or can be worn on as a charm on a string. And their size indicate that them being personal items, regardless of which animal they represent, they were personal items. And if they indeed represent a single animal, if this animal is a donkey, then they reflect the continuous tradition of the early Bronze Age, yes, during which donkeys were, they contain strong symbolism, the values, a topic which will be touched upon in this conference. But if they represent something else, and here I present a comparison from Hari Ham and from one of the petroglyphs recently interpreted and published by Shumer and Ekutieli, they also may represent dogs. It could be also other animals, but all of the animals that I could think of and I could find parallels, they are animals which are typical of a mobile way of life. They accompany the man, or they are wild if it's a ram, and they represent either something that is being hunted or something that accompanies man in a mobile way of life. When dealing with ritual, one must deal also with social theory. So Durkheim theorized that ritual codifies social facts, and Rappaport famously regarded ritual as the basic social act. And going even further, it appears that ritual is an engine actively involved in culture making rather than just in preserving. And ritual often alters the intentional and communicative quality of action. This is why investigating into ritual practices is in fact investigating into social fabric of past communities and how they shape their social culture. What intrigues me in social ceremonies is that they play a central part in transmission of knowledge and cultural and collective memory. And this concept of collective memory, it reappears time and time again in the context of the Intermediate Bronze Age, and it should be taken with great consideration, and its transmission should be taken in great consideration in light of the long period that this period occupied. In an analysis of pottery of area 700, long-term storage vessels and drinking vessels were most common. And I bring here an example of the better preserved room with a complete assemblage of a drinking kit kept together with the large long-term storage jars, which are not presented here. Only the drinking kit is presented here. It appears that every household marked on the plan with the dotted orange line had their own storage or room with their own long-term storage and their own drinking kit. More precisely, two groups of drinking kits can be distinguished. I divided them into groups which have typological, certain typological continuity, possibly practical continuity from the early Bronze Age 3, which include the jug, the amphoriskos, and the carinated bowl, even though they do go through certain morphological change. And the second group is what is commonly referred to as the caliciform culture, and contains the teapots and the goblets of the various sizes. And you can see that we have this room had a very large amount of both storage jars and these cups, and they were stored together. Evidence of communal eating comes in the form of large, deep bowls. Out of the two most common bowl types represented in the houses excavated in area 700, the open bowl with a beveled rim, the one on the bottom right, is the most common type, and it represents more than half of the bowls discovered, and it represents more than 3/4 if we exclude the carinated bowl, which I consider a drinking vessel rather than an eating vessel. Now this type, and you can see the diameters of the bowls that were measured at the bottom. So the bowl on the right, on the left bottom side, measures from 22 to 36 centimeters, which is by itself a nice considerable size. But the open bowls with the beveled rims measure from 26 to 50, and a lot of them actually measure between 40 and 50. So they are very big vessels. These were probably used for a way to consume food in large groups, but also on a household-based activity. Since in every household we found representations of these large, these large bowls. Now I also, they are considered in some ceramic reports as platters, which on one hand is a little bit misleading because it's kind of, it is reminiscent, or it's connected in some way through its name to the platters of the EB3, but they're they're much larger. They have to do with conspicuous consumption and feasting, and these are in fact deeper bowls for domestic consumption. They are for communal consumption, but it's slightly different. However, communal eating continues into this period, as we can see from here. I also would like to suggest what was eaten in these bowls based on the cookware that was found in the houses. So very large whole-mouth cooking pots, closed, very with globular bodies, were found, and ladles or spoons like the one at the top photo. And I suggest that what was consumed in these large bowls was stews or certain types of porridges which were cooked in these cookware and served in these deep bowls and maybe consumed by the extended household members, or only the household members, with a bread of sorts. The communal eating and drinking, yes. This is particularly interesting because it stands in contrast to some preliminary zooarchaeological finds published in the past by Leora Kolska-Horowitz, who leads zooarchaeological research on the site. So she analyzed bones from two domestic contexts, one of a tomb. So the first one is going back to area 100, next to the standing stone in an ashy pit, an assemblage of burnt bones, which was mainly consistent 3/4 of Caprovine bones, with some cattle, some pig, and one equid tooth. And the second in area 500, which was an assemblage from the inside of the house that came from an area with lots of crushed long-term storage jars, very large storage jars, which showed a very similar picture. And these are the graphs, these are the pie charts, showing 3/4 of caprovines, some pig, some cattle, a little bit of one tooth of equid, of an ass from each area. And in the tombs, the situation was slightly different. Sheep, goat remains 3/4 of the assemblage, but not one tooth of a donkey, but limbs of a donkey were discovered in the tomb up hill from Givat Nesua. Yes. And also the cuts that were discovered in the tombs were prime cuts, as opposed to the domestic areas which all cuts were found. So dwelling for a second on the importance of the acquid of the donkey, it's the sacrifice and burial of donkeys during the early Bronze Age was interpreted as a strong marker of identity, personhood, and social status. And I argue that this notion continues to echo within the intermediate Bronze Age community of Nachal Rephaim, especially as we can see through the tombs or the tomb. However, I believe that the presence of equid bones in the burial, equid teeth in ceremonial depositions of animal bones, and possibly equid figurines in domestic context go further than implying on the owner's occupation as tradesmen or just owning donkeys. They have more of, these items have more of an apotropaic character than economic boasting. And it is also suggested by Nir Milevsky, who will speak here later today, that the ass may have represented a family or a guild totem, which could be the case also in Nachal Rephaim. I will just mention that the figurines, the IB figurines, are very different from the donkey figurines of the early Bronze Age. So this piece of information should be considered very gently.
Elena, 5 more minutes.
Yes, thank you. So although most shaft tombs cut and used during the intermediate Bronze Age were either reused during the subsequent Middle Bronze Age or looted in antiquity or modernity, some remained intact. And they include 3 tombs in Nachal Rephaim itself, cave 900 excavated by Shlomit Wexler Abdollah a little bit to the west, Givat Nesua uphill from Nachal Rephaim, the excavations at Gilo conducted by Irena Zilberbrud and Ron Berry, and Man Chatzper, which was excavated by Zahavi and is now being published by Shua Kisilevich. The tomb include the bead type, containing only beads, the warrior type with the copper daggers, composite type, both metal and ceramic finds. Up to this point, it's something very typical. All of them continue, if they contained animal bones, it was sheep or goat, and with one exception of having equid limbs. What is common to these tombs, especially the ones located upslope, is that the site is visible from them, attesting to the connectedness of the community of the dead to the living, or to the living village, watching over it, giving it their blessing, and possibly their right to the land. The vessels from the mortuary context, that's interesting. There are many closed vessels of small, medium size storage jars, amphoras, koi, and jugs. They can be carried manually into the tomb. They're very few, they're not lavish. And it appears that based on the vessels, no communal drinking or eating was conducted during the burial outside of the tomb or inside of the tomb. And no serving vessels, which are very common in, or with two exceptions, or one exception of the tomb with a bowl. There were no serving vessels. So most importantly, the burial was primary. There was no reopening of the tomb. Nobody could be buried in the tomb or have any claim to the tomb or create any type of claim for lineage for the tomb. So what I argue is that much of the traditions and the social memories of this community were transmitted orally within each household in social ceremonies. And they concerned the communal eating and drinking, but only within the household, not in the tombs. And each household, possibly extended household, maintained their own physical representation and their connection with the cosmos in the shape of a standing stone. So we do need to understand how this fragmented community which is household based and doesn't seem to have anything that ties them together in sense of ritual, still was part of the same community. So we need to take a step back and redefine some concepts of cult. The mixture of what is generally defined as cultic, such as standing stones and installations, with a profane, such as everyday storage and activity, is connected to subsistence economy. And it points to a superficial dichotomy that we post as postmodern archaeologists. And as Fowles demonstrated in his book, An Archaeology of Doings, dealing with religious practices of the Pueblo communities, a division into cultic and secular does not exist in pre-modern societies. In this way, building, dams, and communal ceremonies are both actions directly aimed at prosperity of agricultural crops and are equally effective and rational. And they are full of awareness and higher meaning. It is only our secular eyes differentiating the rational from the irrational, which assigns one to the economic action and the other to cultic. But saying everything is religious is like saying nothing is. So how do we gain access to the unseen world of belief of this past society? So I tend to accept Fowles' definition of the Pueblo religious doings as practices characterized by heightened awareness of interconnectedness and relations between things. So let's see how we saw these things in the finds that I presented here. The subsistence economy and social practice of the community was based on the single household, as can be inferred from the long-term storage space, communal eating and drinking related finds, and social ritual. Continuity in communal eating practice, as well as most of the ceramic types, represented continuity in cultural trends and practices from the early Bronze Age 3. Nonetheless, the intense use of newly introduced practices of ceremonial drinking from the northern Levant, along with its accompanying paraphernalia, points to a change in the way the social sphere is behaving, adopting the possible emulating of northern mechanisms of social competition. The household in the Nachal Rafaim, with its standing stone, long-term storage, drinking, and communal eating kits, holds evidence to the private, unmitigated, and direct relationship between household members and their cosmos. Additionally, the doings that they have to do with agricultural produce are filled with cosmological awareness and point to the fact that economic and so-called profane activities were in fact part of a religious practice of this rural society. Furthermore, the absence of communal ritual practices made no room for religious-based social competition.
Elena, it's time to finish. So just quickly finish up.
So last slide, thank you. The tomb represents the members of the community on their best behavior So this best behavior is basically presents a resistance to seriation of class and both perpetuating and generating by economic and social household-based frames and rituals and the individual modest primary burials. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Helena, for a very interesting lecture. We don't have time now for questions. We'll leave them for the end of the session. And I'd like to invite Asafia Surlandau to present the paper by Matthew Susnow of the Hebrew University and Asafia Surlandau of University of Haifa, Cultic Discontinuities in the EBA, IBA, and MBA Temples and Masivot. Asaf, please.
Thank you so much. 2 seconds for putting the slides on. Everybody sees that? Aaron, are we good? Lovely. Good. So on behalf of Matt Sosnov, who cannot be here, and myself, thank you so much for the organizers, Christina and Shira, and thank you so much for our kind host, Aaron Meir. It's absolutely fantastic to see so many distinguished scholars in the audience. I'm a bit thrilled and afraid at the same time, and it's great. We're about to speak about very quickly about 3 eras of cultic practices during the transition between the long periods of both EB and IB and then the MB. While in the EB1 to 3, we have broad room temples. I put question mark there because there's so many that we don't know about the actual function of these. No cultic iconography, no objects that are foci of cult. Then you have in the intermediate Bronze Age, EB4 to intermediate Bronze Age, you have the rise of megaron or in antis long room temples. And at the same time, you have Masevot as foci of cults first appearing, but still no cultic iconography. You'll see that a lot of themes are repeating from previous lectures, but happily, Matt was merciful and did not change the chronology of Megiddo, so that saved me some years of my life. And then at last you have the MB1 to 3, which is the long room temples. They do continuation of the in antis temples and matzevot in either separate or unified context. And this is the so-called iconographic explosion, first appearance of metal figurines and other forms of iconography related to cult. First era is most interesting because you have this long sequence beginning Chalcolithic going all the way to EB4-3 that are broad room temples. And I'm really interested to hear what they can be used for because, of course, I'm quoting all the doubts raised already by Gantz and others about the actual function because you don't see a unified focal point. You have, as in Megiddo, you have numerous focal points in the forms of this beautiful basalt surfaces. And there's no doubt that this is incredibly important place, even on a super regional scale, which is connected with large scale meat preparation and as suggested as one of the possibilities for dining or banqueting. And here you can see of course, the parallels to it from various sides. This is the first era, and immediately after there seems to be some form of a break, which is, and then this is the question, when do you want to start this phenomenon of EB3 or EB4/IB long room or in antis or megaron temples? You choose whatever you like, but I tend to believe, tend to agree that this is indeed happening in the intermediate Bronze Age with all the necessary modification. We have to say, we have to think about the nature of IB in the Southern Levant, which IB begins to be something incredibly important and much more connected to the northern Syrian or Syro-Mesopotamian sphere. And indeed, you see the triple temple before shown and explained so eloquently by Matt of the intermediate Bronze Age. And what I would like to say that this is also a first. That is, you have three of these, and therefore you may hypothesize about it, as was of course said before, about the establishment of a pantheon, or at least a multiple deities that are working together and worship together as part of the same building plan, which is also a first. The shrinking of this assemblage in the later IB, and again, I accept what Matt was saying, that this is occurring in the later IB, but I would also like to say something even more. I would say that it continues into the earliest MB, and there's a possibility that this is occurring without too much problems. And indeed, the Naharia type, seven cup vessel is lovely. And I would say that the two bronze objects shown here, the Anatolian or Minoan bronze axe and the eye axe below, does indeed also belong very well in the later part of the IB as well as the early part of the MB. So I don't have any problems with this. Rather, it works very well with what we will try to present here. And indeed, as shown by numerous eminent scholars, there's no problem by showing the big tradition of the EB4 or IB, depends which part of the Levant or the northern Levant you're talking about. And you see there's two fantastic examples of in antis temples at Ebla, one of them from the early part of the EB4, one of them from the later part of the EB4. And there are, of course, numerous examples. So it is not a hard sell to make the same case for Megiddo. And indeed, when talking about other cases, and here we get into the incorporation of betials or standing stones of Matzevot into this in antis temples, we see the famous examples of El Rawada in Syria, and in which you see a lovely complex which includes both temple or a series of temples, some things that can be, I don't think that are standing stones because there are more things to put offerings or other things on top of them. Look at the level. Somebody was paying attention to put some level to make it level. But again, this is something which is something to be presented in front of this temple. And in the entrance to this complex, or rather at close to the entrance, there's this monumental enclosure in which you have this very, very large stone, now fallen, but before, but no doubt an object of cult, an aptly named Betil by the excavators. And here you can see the relative chronology. I can say more things about the relative and absolute chronology as in all things, but to this talk, it's suffice to say that these all belong to the second half of the third millennium, exactly the period we are talking about. Most importantly, in all of these, you don't have what will appear later, which is a lot of cultic iconography. So the imagery, you still do not have imagery. You have this an iconic representation of the sacred or sublime that we will speak about its meaning later. Indeed, Ben Ami, in his 2008 article, was speaking about EB3 to IBA, extramural standing stones in a series of sites. Matt and I brought you some very nice old images of these at Adair, and a lot of them are in the Transjordan. In Adair, really a magnificent one, and in Babedra, and there used to be ones in Khirbet Iskander also. and in Lejeune and afterwards. I would not dwell on all this description of these early and magnificent explorers that have looked at these. And indeed, Ben-Ami is arguing that the Gezer complex does belong to the IB. We do not absolutely buy that, but we think about this as a continuous tradition. We'll speak about it later. Unfortunately or fortunately, outside Megiddo, you don't have too many cult places of the IB. It's possible that they are buried underneath other cult places of the MB or under alluvium of other places. But of course, everybody quotes the Tel Ashir, one just opposite of Tel Poleg at the estuary, close to the estuary of Nahal Poleg, excavated by Gofna, which have an open air cult site with matzevot and taboons and cooking and a lot of ash. And it looks like this, and this is an open field with a row of matzevot, and of course what you expect to find around them. That is activity of cooking, of perhaps banqueting on a very, very small scale, but definitely belonging to the intermediate Bronze Age. This is a lovely example, I would say, of a cult place of a community that does not have to be immediately by a site. So we can imagine in the intermediate Bronze Age that you have such cult sites, rather vernacular, rather without large cultic architecture. That is, not every site is Megiddo, that is existing to every small community and even communities that are semi-mobile throughout the year. The nature of the ceremony is, of course, an inclusive ceremony in which the entire community, because it's not enclosed, or if there is an enclosure wall, it's rather large, but you can have the entire community take part in it. And then you can see the lack of similarity between the stones. Every stone have a meaning. We'll try to understand and we'll try to decipher it later. Everybody loves the cult Kaiv at Kedesh, so we will mention it too. Plenty of caliciform, will not elaborate about it, was elaborated before. Probably some feasting. There is small cooking pots among these cultic finds. And most importantly, there is this pillar that may have been used as matzeva because the central hewn pillar does have a ledge that is you can put some offering on it. It does look like somebody was making this sacred landscape inside the cave. The cave was not sufficient. You have to make it into some form of a sacred landscape by this small highland community of the Galilee. We get to the third era, and this is the in antis temples and matzevot are co-occurring, and you have the aniconic standing stones, foci of cult in the southern Levant, together with this large or sometimes small and sometimes larger temples in Antis, then therefore they develop afterwards to the Syrian temples. Here you can see the Tel Kitan one, which is great because you have this lovely example of an in Antis temple of the NB1, and in front of it you see a row of matzevot and standing stones. All of them are uniconic apart from this one, which is semi-iconic. Okay, so you see how these things are beginning to reside together, and you see the difference between the enclosed and the open. Almost the same thing is happening at Tel El Hayat temple precinct in the Transjordan, in which you can see this beautiful Syrian style structure and these matzevot all around it, all around one of the corners, merging the, let's say, the official and perhaps the vernacular, although they are very well made. The obelisk temple at Byblos is unique by having Egyptian influence obelisk, and at the same time you have Biblian anchors of the MB1 used also as matzevot, probably as ex-votos. And at the end, you have the high place of Gezer. Diva would like it to be MB3. I'm not convinced it is not MB3, but please look at the difference in sizes and in shapes of the stones. It's possible that each of them reflect a different event and commemorate something different. It's so interesting that after monumental structures at Megiddo and the Megiddo in the MB1 and 2, you have a new cultic place, which is inside and by this monumental palace that is being built in 12, you have these very, very small vernacular, even personal field of matzevot that are really important. And notice the difference in the between this monumental and organized and this small field that does continue. I would agree with Matt that it does continue previous IB traditions well into the MB, and indeed you see here something that is maybe an inclusive place of worship. However, another thing is happening with the internationalization of the MB, which is the appearance or the appearance of iconography and especially metal figurines that brings for the first time the notion that people are interacting with anthropomorphic deities, both female and male, probably creating pantheons. There are numerous styles of them found at Megiddo, cultic place, some of them all the way to the late Bronze Age, and of course at Hatzor, various areas on the Acropolis and in Gezer, and at Byblos, hundreds of them in a temple of the obelisk as part of dedications. Naharia is something lovely. Naharia, you have a small cultic place best connected with the polity of Capri, or that's what would you like to see that, beginning to operate in the MB1. And then you have also a structure by it. The structure itself has some form of a bama close to it, or some form of a ramp, and another place in which perhaps you have stelae, and there are several phases of this, still awaiting final publication. The lovely occurrence of these 7 cup vessels, so nicely interpreted by Liat Naeh to be symbolism connected with perhaps the goddess Ishtar, and the number 7, I totally buy into it, is accompanied by a very, very large number of metal figurines. Each of them is distinctively different from the other in modes of production and in style and even in the metal, indicating that probably close to this coastal shrine, or that also is on top of a road going from the north to south, you have new influences and new ways to think and to interact with the deities that are impacted by more Mediterranean areas. You can see that. Another thing which is happening in Nahariya is, of course, activities of cooking, which occurs outside, which does show a continuation with the IB. Just mentioning the same phenomenon at Hatzor, later that by this huge complex, you have the very, very vernacular field of small matzevot, very personal, confronted by the very monumental. Of course, in Syria, and of course, in Chatzor, you have matzevot that are iconic, but this is a phenomenon which is rare outside Chatzor. What are we thinking about matzevot? And in the last 8 minutes of my talk, I will speak about it and summarize. The texts from the Bronze Age are rather in agreement that you have etymology, nakedin sikanu, sakanu in Ugaritic, meaning to reside or to dwell or to place or to erect. And these stones are being used in the feast of Ishtar and Dagan, and in Emar, in various sacrificial rites, and in Ugarit, it is connected to deceased ancestor, and in the Hittite sphere, these are the massive Huwashi sacred stones that can be either a smaller stone or even a complex. I will not speak about all these parallels in archaeology, but very briefly talk about the sample of this text. Thus, say from Mari, this is a text from the first half of the 18th century. Because of the festival for my lord Ishtar, I wrote. That festival is near, yet the stele is not available. The shikanum is not. Send 100 workmen and a reliable man who knows how to make a cult stele. Okay, so this festival, you need a very, very, very large stele, okay, and very well cut. Another one is saying on the 6th day of the month in Mari, 7 sheep were sacrificed at the temple of Dagan. One was for Dagan, the others were for the cult stele. And from Ugarit, later, of course, 13th century BCE, he who sets the Shikanu for his father god in the sanctuary, a holy incense stand in the shrine of his family. So we see how these stones are connected with sacrifice, commemoration, kinship. Of course, in Greek, and in later Iron Age and later tradition, these are connected with a various of uses like border stones, stelae that are dedicatory, and of course we get from Philo of Byblos the term betilus, which is of course of Semitic origin, the house of the gods, stone endowed with life, which means that they are connected with a presence which is inside them. And Hesiod is speaking about stones in sanctuaries as commemorative for an event, and the same is done by Heracles, who is putting these 2 major stelae on both sides of the Mediterranean in its entrance, its exit to the Atlantic Ocean, or in Goddess Gadara in his temple. So, how to summarize all these things? I would say, or we would say very cautiously, that we were sure before beginning to work on this lecture that the birth of the true Canaanite cult, I don't know what true Canaanite cult is, but most of what we think as a Canaanite cult does begin in the MB1. Rather, now we would like to think about the birth of most critical elements of Canaanite cult, rather in the intermediate Bronze Age, and we are talking about the in antis temples and the contemporary use of standing stones. Temples in antis do begin in the IB, continue in the MB. There is probably a continuity in Megiddo. That's great. We need better evidence to fix the chronology. And one more clean locus apart from locus 4009 will do the trick. I'm sure Matt will find it. Kadesh and Ashir sites do emphasize the rural and natural landscapes of the local microregion. And they're becoming an integral part of the religious landscape. That is, Kadesh Cave inside the mountain, Tel Ashir on a hill opposing the sea. So we have places that are deeply connected to the landscape. And Kadesh and Ashir sites do demonstrate through the IB aniconic tendencies, communal activities, and matzevot, inclusive rather than exclusive cult. While open cult places with matzevot seems to be almost in competing tradition within Antis temples in the MB. First, you have them in the IB at Megiddo, then you have an open field with stelae in the earliest MB, then and again in Megiddo, you have a large so-called Syrian temple. Should we think about dual way of thinking of exclusive practices, formal versus vernacular? One thing that you do with the stelae, another thing you do with the temples in Antis. And how would we place the iconography? Are the stelae connected with the iconography of deities that is beginning to proliferate in the MB1? Or, as I would think, and as Matt and I would think, that you have this long-rooted, aniconic tradition that do continue from the IB into the MB, which is in stark dichotomy to this imagery, which also appears in the ivy. So much to do, and I thank you for your attention.
Asaf, thank you very much. Excellent talk. And we have plenty of time for discussion. And I see already that Itzik Paz raised his hand to ask a question. So Itzik, please ask your question. Of course, say to who you're asking it.
Okay, I will first more comments than questions. First for Uzi's lecture, he mentions that there are no early Bronze One sites at the Negev Highland. This is not true. I know that there are many sites that are dated to the EB1, and even recently, some of which were excavated and contain also Egyptian activity. And I think in recent years, there are more and more sites that can be dated to the late fourth millennium. Now, for the last lecture for Asaf, several things. First of all, the standing stones that are found along the Jordan Valley, the menhir, some of them at least are clearly connected to early bronze fortified sites, like Herbet Iskander. And the one that you showed from Lejeune is connected to a newly discovered and excavated site that is found on the crest of the hill, excavated by Jennifer John. And it is dated to the EB1, to EB2, maybe EB3. Also, I think the birth of Canaanite cult is way earlier in the EB1, EB2, EB3. And there is iconography that is connected with cultic iconography. It is not so common, true, and it is not so abundant, but it is there. It is found, and it can be reflected in what we call cultic cylinder seal impressions that are quite common. We have dozens of them, and for many sites, and they show ceremonies that are connected to what I will expand on this when I will talk about an Asur, but what we call the sacred marriage. And this is a ceremony that is, it contains a lot of festivities, including dancing and banqueting and other things. And they are all reflected in cylinder seal impression. We also have the Arad Stela that depicts the same type of ceremony. And we have Celtic architecture. We have the temples or the shrines or the precincts or whatever we call them, and they are not so abundant, true, but they do exist. We have figurines. We have animal figurines. We have very few, but we have human figurines that may depict deities. We have also miniature vessels that have some kind of a cultic significance. I even wrote about the small bowls that were found in Leviah. So the point is that cultic activity exists. Cultic iconography exists. It's not so abundant, but it is found already during the early Bronze 1, 2, and 3. Thank you.
Can I reply, please, to Itzik?
Please.
Okay. About the lack of EB1 and EB3 in the Negev. What I presented was the result of the archaeological survey of the Negev Highlands, but in several articles, some of them together with Miki Saban and David Ilan, we proved that there is EB1 in the Negev. So I was not so wrong about it. The surveyor of the Negev was wrong about it.
Anything else, Uzi?
That's all.
Okay, thank you. Asaf, would you like to react?
But very briefly, yes, it's a matter. I'm thinking about what you're saying. It's like first about the standing stone. Certainly, that's why I also said I also put EB3 in parentheses there. I absolutely agree that this is a phenomenon which is working very well. Not working so much with EB temples, but does work. The second thing is about iconography. Yes, there is iconography, and this is also something I thought about it, but the iconographic explosion does not begin earlier than MB1. You can see how many examples you have of iconography of the EB that does have some kind of cultic meaning, which is not cylinder seals or their impression, which is basically the Arad stele, which is of course important, but this is one example. So my point was, it exists, but it's not a focus. Okay, it's different and it's changing nature after the end of the IP. So I think we do agree, but the question is, how much can we read into iconography and its meaning in early Bronze Age 1 or early Bronze Age 1 and 2 temples? And I would risk and say that iconography is rather rare in the examples of the temples that were presented in the various articles by Adams and Castell and others. And this is the unusual rather than the unusual.
Okay, thank you. David Ilan, you raised your hand. If you could put your, hi, David.
Hi
Please.
there. Can you hear me okay? Good. A question for Matt Adams. Regarding the foundation deposit of the Egyptian material, aside from the fact that there is perhaps some kind of connection via Byblos with Egypt, what do you think for religiously, politically, have an Egyptian style, an intermediate Bronze Age temple, especially?
דוד, לא שומעים אותך.
Yeah, you cut in and out a little bit.
Oh, so should I repeat the question?
Yeah, please.
So the basic question is, can you hear me?
Yes.
What are the implications of the foundation deposit, culturally, religiously, politically, especially given how we're always placing our emphasis on connections to the north?
Yeah, really good question. I wish I had an answer for you. Anything I might say would be awfully speculative at this point. I mean, I suspect that this level at Megiddo is relatively ephemeral. It kind of comes out of nowhere, apparently. I mean, presumably EB3 Megiddo had been abandoned for some amount of time before these guys show up and start building these temples. And then as you know from stratum 14, that those temples kind of disappear. In fact, the two twin temples do not seem to have ever been completed. No floor or altar was found in one of them. So I suspect it's a fairly ephemeral situation. And it's just sort of one of these random blips on the radar. So I don't, even if we were to figure out what the significance of this moment is, it probably didn't matter because it had no lasting effect, I think. That said, certainly Egyptian contact with Byblos, as far as we know from inscriptional material, seems to stop with the end of the 6th dynasty. There is some suggestion that during the first intermediate period, there may have been some interaction with Byblos, the Monet jar, for example. The date for this at Byblos, which has all of these, hundreds of objects inside of it, has been suggested to be late first intermediate period as well. Could it be that at some point when the Egyptians do start interacting with the Levant again in the first intermediate period, they do so first with Megiddo? I don't know. Like I said, I'm really guessing here.
Well, I can point out that you yourself wrote recently regarding the Sinue narrative that because of the change in chronology, that there is no longer a dissonance. It works.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, obviously, there are problems with Sinue and the date of its composition and all of this sort of thing. But yeah.
Thank you. Actually, Matt, I have this little question for you. If you look at this, that extra temple that you're trying to reconstruct, there's a very interesting phenomenon. Then you have this back and forth change in orientation. It's sort of like the earliest stratum 19 temple faces east, and then you face north, and then you face east again, and then you face north again. It's a very interesting change there. What do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I've seen that too. I don't think it's significant. I did at one point, but with our excavations under the Great Temple, there's clearly another large building under there that has the same orientation as the Great Temple. So I suspect we're seeing a kind of we're not seeing the whole picture, and that there are probably multiple temples at Megiddo in all of these periods at the same time. We're just seeing a small sliver of it.
Oh, Helena, please, you wanted to ask something. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask both Asaf and Matt, how can their claims be connected? Because from what I understand from Asaf's talk, Asaf claims that the Canaanite ritual or the Canaanite cultic practice started with the IBA traditions, but the IBA traditions which are from the northern Levant and kind of trickled down to the southern Levant and mixed with local traditions and brought forth what we know later as the Canaanite cult. And with Matt's presentation, which was very compelling, these temples also speak something more of a northern Levantine culture, and also the trade with Egypt and Byblos, something very extra southern Levant. And it also is placed in the later part of the period, bringing us closer to this, urban transformation or the MB that we know of that later Asaf talked about. So how can we connect these two things?
Before you start, both of you, please keep it short because we have just a few minutes before the next session. So please go ahead.
So 60 seconds, Aaron. The answer is yes. There's a lot of IB according to radiocarbon, and there's maybe like 600 years of IB, and there's a lot going on there. And there's a lot going on in Syria during that time. And it's a lot far from collapsing. So Helena would say, absolutely yes. The level of connectivity in the IB is much larger and many other things besides these lovely caliciforms are coming from the north. And once we understand more how it's happened, we'll begin to understand how is this influx of ideas and I'm sure that also people wandering between the great areas of Syria and Lebanon and Israel is happening during the IB already, thus preparing the world that afterwards we will see at Sinuche, okay, and afterwards we'll see it in other places, which is an already interconnected world in the 20th century BCE.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, briefly. Yeah, I agree with Asaf. I think during this entire intermediate Bronze Age periods, and I hesitate to use this word, it's just for convenience, that we're seeing kind of waves of interaction. And the IB Megiddo wave, didn't really work out. And then there was, what becomes MB Megiddo and the MB1 really is a different wave of some sort.
We have to stop now. So thank you very much to the speakers and to the questions. And if there's additional discussion, we can continue at the end of the third session. And now we have 2 more minutes before we start the next session, and Shira will take over as the chair. So you're all welcome to run out and have lunch now in the next 2 minutes. And we'll see you back in at 12:30. See you soon.